We're living through a crisis of trust. A 2017 Pew Center study of 38 countries found that on average, just 14% of people have a lot of trust in their governments to do the right thing. In a 2018 Pew Center study, it found that more than a third of Americans have low trust in other Americans. Worse yet, nearly half of young adults under 30 fell into that low trusters group. By the way, those surveys in the US were done before the pandemic, and they were done before this last election. So as change leaders, that makes our jobs tough. Reverend Jen Bailey of the Faith Matters Network once said, "Social change moves at the speed of relationships, and relationships move at the speed of trust." It may not be in our job descriptions, but as leaders, we have to start with trust. We created Weave, the Social Fabric Project here at the Aspen Institute, to take on the trust crisis. The solution, we believe, starts locally. In every community that we've looked at, we see people, often quietly, building connection with others by focusing on what we share rather than on how we differ. They extend an arc of trust in ever-widening circles to include people from different backgrounds and different experiences. We call these folks weavers. And our project exists to connect them, to support them, and to inspire new generations of weavers. You can learn more about our work at weareweavers.org. I'm honored to be with two of the weavers you've already met in videos today. We saw the work María Vallarino is doing with the Todo Panama civic movement. She's also president of the Verde Azul Foundation and a Central America Leadership Initiative Fellow. Ashley Bell spoke of his work with the Black Bank Fund and Foundation. He's also founder of the 2020 Bipartisan Justice Center focused on criminal justice reform and a civil society fellow. Ana Maria, I'll start with you. Your work with Todo Panama brought community voices to the table around COVID-19 so people could be part of the decisions that affect their lives. What did you and others have to do to create enough trust in those people so they would join the process?
Thank you, Michael, and good morning to everyone. Like you said and you mentioned, we were working together in group in a big coalition. We brought to the table key stakeholders. It was not only about the fellows of the Central America Leadership Initiative working together, it was with the private sector, the nonprofit, civic groups, civil society, unions. We were bringing everybody to the table and giving them voice. Also, we understanding that to generate trust, it takes time. And due to the urgency of the situation, we had to leverage on the trust our allies already had. And with that, we also made sure that we had a basic legal and governance structure to give this transparency and accountability that is also important to generate trust. But the most important in terms of building trust with the community, like already Eric Liu mentioned it, we were listening and listening to understand, not to fix, not to prove our point, not to answer back, but really to understand the barriers, to understand the circumstances, the communities we were aiming to serve were living, the fears they had, recognizing that these fears were real and not just dismissing them. So it was really important to come to the table wholeheartedly to listen, to caring, to listen what they had to say. And we did it not only with the communities, but also with our donors, asking for feedback and advice in other countries to see what they were doing. So we came in with this learning mentality instead of a knowing mentality. It was more important to getting it right the first time because we had no time to do those changes. We needed to get it right instead of being right.
So you noted that trust takes time. And I think that's often something that as leaders, we often feel pressed by time. And so being able to slow down the clock and just pay attention to the relationships is critical. You also mentioned leveraging the trust of others. And I imagine when you talk about bringing all the stakeholders in and doing a lot of listening, that part of what you're doing is you're bringing the people in who already have trust with communities you're trying to reach.
Not only with the communities, the nonprofits were a big help in that because they already had done the work of being in these communities for a long periods of time, but also the trust on donors because we needed the funds to carry on the programs and the initiatives. We needed the help of volunteers, and with that, the civic groups that came in. So they were the ones that were rallying up the volunteers. So really, we needed to work together and understanding that others that had already a time being in their different fields had already done the work of creating this trust.
Thank you. Ashley, you work with people who have centuries of good reason to mistrust the system. What do you say and do to inspire people to invest in trusting and engaging?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, it is a complicated one because when you have decades of mistrust because of systems that have failed people, when people who are in underserved communities know that the system works, but it just doesn't work for them, it's a challenge. And where we start is finding friends of goodwill. For all of those who are willing to stand up for injustice, willing to join in the fight of curing our systems of these systemic inequalities, it's about being there for the march, being there for the protests, but what happens after that is even more important. And so the trust is that you'll be there on social media applauding new efforts as they emerge around the world to create justice, but also as you applaud that you actually are willing to stick around and do the work. I think people who are disenfranchised, people who live in these underserved communities around the world are used to a quick fad of someone being excited or empowered or just engaged during the moment of distress. But what happens next? And I think what we were able to show with the Black Bank Foundation is that we marched after George Floyd was murdered together with people of all backgrounds across political spectrums. But after the march was the meeting. The meeting was where we had a commitment, not just for that day, but for years to come. And I think as we all think about where we have stood in times of crisis around the world, that we ask ourselves, where is our true commitment? Have we truly dedicated our time, our resources, and our talents to those causes long term? And what does that look like?
People can sense that deep commitment. And so, as you say, kind of showing up after the march, after the cameras are off, and showing that you're sticking with them, I think is so crucial, as you said, to kind of building trust. I'd like to go to the personal level. Ana Maria, how do you muster the resilience to give trust and to model it, especially when you're dealing with people who, shall we say, resist change, to put it mildly?
I think we all resist change in a level. That's what makes us human, and also our fears and our past experiences, our traumas, everything builds up this complexity of being human. And recognizing that I myself, for example, when I was in early 2019, when I was diagnosed with a sarcoma in the blood vessels of my liver, I was forced to stop and understand that I was not this superwoman, understand that I was so focused on fixing things and fixing others, and really people and things don't need fixing, right? And we can only work on ourselves. So what I have done and worked for me, at least a game changer in my experience, is turning into myself, self-awareness. And how can I, instead of forcing, provoking that trust, inspiring that trust, and doing is showing myself and that vulnerability, that with my light and my darkness, and sharing it. And when I open up to share the thing that, I'm a perfectly imperfect, and the things that I don't know, but I want to learn, that creates a safe space for others to also open up. And when we start sharing more than what we do and what we believe, but the small stuff, and when we start interacting to really get to know each other, that's what I've seen, that trust starts building. We start creating these connections that we see that we have a lot of things in common with people that sometimes we feel that, oh my God, I cannot believe what he's thinking, what he's doing. But when we sit down and we start engaging in these conversations, recognizing our human dignity, we start generating these connections. And I love a phrase that Brené Brown says, that it's really hard to hate up close, so move in. So every time I'm in a situation when I don't understand where that person is coming from, or it's making me feel uncomfortable, I turn to myself to see, why am I feeling uncomfortable in this situation? And also, why is this person feeling, really trying to understand and know? And at the end, it's about individuals. It's about people. And that's how we start generating one by one. We start generating that trust.
And it's so easy to forget that it's about individuals. What you said earlier really struck me, that we often go into a mindset where people and things need fixing, and they don't need fixing. They need to be related to. So thank you. Ashley, how about you? In your criminal justice reform work, do you offer trust, or do you wait till it is earned? What do you try to model in your work?
Well, a big similarity between my work with 2020 Bipartisan Justice Center and the National Black Bank Foundation is being intentional about working with people who have different ideologies and different political backgrounds. Both organizations were founded by people who are conservative and liberal. You have to really sit down and ask yourself, what's bigger than politics? What's bigger than our divides? There may be 10 things 10 big issues, 8 of them we may disagree on fundamentally, but 2 we may, and that's where we can find common ground. But I think it begins many times with understanding that history matters. And when you look back at history and you understand the different experiences of people in your community, that we all may have different roads, but we're on the same journey. Everybody wants happiness. Everybody wants to have a family and a community that they can, find fulfillment. And when you look at the history of how our criminal justice system has failed so many people, how Jim Crow has had a devastating effect on America, but Jim Crow had relatives that live in South Africa, that live in India, that live in England, and how these underserved communities around the world, if you can listen and understand how we got to where we are, then I think that's where trust begins, with that transparency, with that understanding that I'm going to take the time to understand how we got here. And once everybody at least understands how we got to where we are right now, then you can have an honest conversation about where you go next. Because it's important to recognize why people distrust. And when you can recognize and identify that, then you can unpack, how do you rebuild it? And it begins with people who are willing to listen, to learn, and to love like the world depends on it, because it does.
Yeah, and also, again, when we're trying to solve problems, it's easy to forget or ignore the past and just focus on the present issues that are in our face. So that's a wonderful reminder that we have to understand where things came from and why they came from there. In the few minutes we've got left, I'm going to ask each of you, and start with you, Ashley, what will it take to create trust on a society-wide scale? And what 2 or 3 actions can leaders take to start building trust? Ashley, you up first.
We live in a world right now, we saw a complete, yeah, I'm here. So I was saying that we live in America, especially even around the world, in a reckoning with racial inequities. George Floyd, you see so many corporations that are making statements every day around the world about their commitment to justice and their commitment to equality. And I think that we finished the announcement phase. Now we're entering the accountability phase. So this is where trust has a chance to be sustained. This is where all of us, wherever we work, wherever we invest our time and our treasure, must hold the institutions accountable that said that they're going to support justice and a new way of living in this world and a new era of equality. Hold them accountable. Ask the questions. Where you work, where you spend your time, where you have faith, are their actions really reflective of all these statements, and are your values lined up with the organizations that you commit your time and talent? This is our moment to create trust. This is after the march. Now it's time to sign up for the future.
Wow, thank you. Ana Maria, what do you think it will take to create trust in your nation and other nations? And what 2 to 3 actions can leaders take to make that happen?
Thank you, Michael. I mean, at the end, like I mentioned before, nations, societies, institutions, and corporations are made of people. And it is going down to the individual level and rebuilding relationships. And like Ashley just mentioned, caring to ask those questions, caring enough to understand. I believe if we start focusing on the core, on the individual, and then start building up, then we can start building trust on a bigger level. And recommendations that I would give is you can't orchestrate from the top. Get proximate, get to know the people you work with, the communities you serve, and at the same time, normalize asking questions. Let it create that safe space for not knowing, but the importance of wanting to learn, wanting to understand. And the only way to understand is to ask questions. And at the same time, and this is something that we do a lot in Todo Panama, at least with the different teams of the committees, we have a classroom mentality that we all come in to learn, but we also have a recess, like we call it the recreo in Spanish, the recess, where we do the small talk, where we engage in these conversations to know how the others are doing, what they're feeling, and if we saw a movie or knew something, because that starts generating this, we start knitting together this relationship that it is much more about what we are doing, but we care enough to do it together and stick together in the long run.
I love the idea of making sure we all have time for recess, and we'll get that a little bit after the question and answer period. Thank you, Ana Maria and Ashley. Your work is inspiring, and I think it will help us ensure that trust is part of our work plans as leaders.